Picture this: a thriving civilization, bustling with life, suddenly vanishes. No warning, no clear reason, just empty streets, abandoned homes, and silent temples left to crumble beneath the weight of time. These aren't scenes from a dystopian novel. They're real moments in history where entire cultures disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only ruins and whispers of their existence. How does a society once so vibrant simply dissolve into the shadows? What forces, natural or man-made, could erase a people so completely that even their stories are lost? These questions haunt archaeologists, historians, and curious minds alike, pulling us into the enigma of ancient disappearances. From the sun-baked cliffs of the American Southwest to the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, the remnants of vanished civilizations whisper secrets we're still struggling to decode. Some collapses were gradual, slipping away like sand through fingers, while others were abrupt, catastrophic events snuffing out cultures in an instant. But in every case, the absence speaks louder than the ruins themselves. The Maya, with their towering pyramids swallowed by the jungle, the Roanoke colonists leaving only a single cryptic clue behind. The Indus Valley people whose advanced cities fell into silence. These aren't just footnotes in history, they're gripping mysteries that challenge our understanding of human resilience and fragility. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. 30 of the most baffling disappearances of ancient peoples, cases that defy easy explanation and beckon us to look deeper. Some of these stories will sound like legends, others like cautionary tales, but all of them are real. This isn't just a recounting of facts, it's an invitation to step into the unknown, to walk alongside those who have puzzled over these vanishings for centuries. By the end, you won't just know about these lost civilizations, you'll feel the weight of their absence, the thrill of the unanswered, and maybe even glimpse a thread of truth woven through the mystery. Ready to uncover history's greatest disappearing acts? Let's begin. The story of the Roanoke Colony is one of those mysteries that lingers like fog over the Carolina coast, thick, haunting, and impossible to ignore. In 1587, 115 English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island, led by John White. They were supposed to establish a foothold in the New World, but when White returned from a supply run to England 3 years later, the entire colony had vanished. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just an eerie silence and 2 cryptic clues. The word Croatoan carved into a tree and the letters CRO etched into a post. So what happened? Theories range from the plausible to the bone-chilling. Some historians believe the settlers integrated with the nearby Croatoan tribe, a peaceful indigenous group. Evidence like European-style artifacts found among Croatoan descendants fuels this idea. Others argue the colonists fell victim to disease, starvation, or conflict with hostile tribes. But then there are the darker whispers, tales of supernatural forces, curses, or even an otherworldly abduction. The lack of definitive answers has turned Roanoke into a blank canvas for speculation where history meets legend. What makes this disappearance so gripping isn't just the mystery, it's the human element. These weren't faceless figures from a dusty textbook. They were families, mothers, fathers, children, who vanished without a trace. Their story forces us to confront how fragile survival was in those early days of colonization, and how quickly a community could slip through the cracks of history. The word Croatoan isn't just a clue, it's a ghost, an unanswered question that still echoes centuries later. Deep in the jungles of Central America, stone towers rise above the canopy, their steps worn by centuries of rain. These are the remnants of the Maya, a civilization that once thrived with such brilliance, only to leave their great cities empty by the 9th century. Imagine walking through Tikal at its peak, surrounded by bustling markets, astronomers tracking Venus, and scribes recording history on bark paper. Then picture those same streets decades later, silent, overgrown, the grand plazas reclaimed by roots and vines. How does a society so advanced, mastering mathematics, building pyramids, perfecting calendars, simply walk away from it all? The truth is, the Maya didn't vanish overnight. Their collapse was a slow unraveling, a tapestry of pressures tearing at the fabric of their world. First, the environment turned against them. Tree rings tell a story of crushing droughts, decades where rain barely fell, crops withered, and reservoirs dried to cracked mud. In a civilization dependent on maize, water wasn't just life, it was power. When rulers couldn't summon the rains through ritual, their divine authority crumbled like the parched earth beneath them. But nature wasn't the only culprit. Carvings on temple walls reveal another shadow: war. As resources dwindled, kingdoms that once traded jade and obsidian began raiding each other. Not the ceremonial battles of earlier eras, but brutal, desperate conflicts. In Dos Pilas, archaeologists found mass graves, families slaughtered, their bones left in chaotic heaps. The Maya had always known warfare, but this was different. This was annihilation. And then there are the monuments, or rather, the silence where they should be. In city after city, the last dated stelae, those carved stone records of kings and conquests, simply stop. Like a book missing its final chapters, the story cuts off mid-sentence. Palink's last inscription, 799, Capon's 822. After those dates, the scribes put down their chisels, the astronomers abandoned their observatories. The people who remained melted into the jungle, leaving behind empty ball courts and palaces where howler monkeys now chorus at dusk. Yet here's the twist: the Maya never truly disappeared. Millions still speak Mayan languages today, preserving traditions that stretch back millennia. What faded was the political order, the god kings and their stone citadels. The civilization didn't die, it transformed, proving that even the mightiest empires are just chapters in a much longer story. The ruins whisper a warning: no society, no matter how brilliant, is immune to the pressures of a changing world. High in the cliffs of the American Southwest, nestled within sandstone alcoves, lie the ghostly remains of a people who once thrived against all odds, the Anasazi, or as many prefer to call them today, the ancestral Puebloans. By the year 1300, their sprawling cliff dwellings, like those at Mesa Verde, stood empty. These weren't just abandoned homes, they were masterpieces of engineering, entire villages tucked into rock faces, with towers reaching toward the sky and kivas, circular ceremonial chambers carved into the earth. Then suddenly the ladders were pulled up, the hearths went cold, and the echoes of daily life faded into the wind. Why would a people walk away from such ingenuity, from generations of history etched into stone? The answer begins with the land itself. Tree rings from that era tell a grim story, a megadrought stretching nearly 50 years, one of the most severe in the region's history. For the ancestral Puebloans, water wasn't just scarce, it was vanishing. Their crops of maize, beans, and squash withered in the relentless sun, and the once reliable seeps and springs dried to dust. But drought alone doesn't explain the urgency of their departure. These were a resilient people who'd survived harsh conditions before. The difference this time: they'd pushed their environment to the brink. Archaeologists find evidence of deforestation, timber cut for construction and firewood, leaving slopes bare and vulnerable to erosion. Soil exhausted from centuries of farming yielded less each season. The very cliffs that sheltered them may have become traps, their resources stripped beyond recovery. Yet the story doesn't end with collapse. Unlike other vanished civilizations, the ancestral Puebloans left a trail, one that leads directly to the living Pueblo tribes of today. Hopi, Zuni, and other southwestern peoples carry forward traditions, languages, and oral histories that trace back to these cliff dwellings. Pottery styles, religious practices, even the designs of modern Pueblo homes echo those of Mesa Verde. This wasn't a disappearance, it was a migration, a deliberate choice to seek new beginnings. But why the suddenness? Some researchers point to signs of violence, burned buildings, defensive structures hastily built near the end. Others suggest social unrest, a breakdown in the communal ties that had held villages together. Perhaps the droughts ignited conflicts over dwindling resources, or spiritual leaders lost authority when prayers for rain went unanswered. What's striking is the care with which many sites were left. Doorways were sealed, artifacts placed deliberately, as if the people intended to return, or ensure nothing was disturbed in their absence. The legacy of the ancestral Puebloans isn't one of mystery but of adaptation. Their descendants still dance to honor the rain, still tell stories of the old ones who climbed down from the cliffs. The empty dwellings stand not as monuments to failure, but to resilience, a reminder that sometimes survival means knowing when to walk away. Long before the Aztecs and Maya rose to power, the Olmec civilization laid the foundation for Mesoamerican culture only to vanish, leaving behind enigmatic stone giants staring blindly into the jungle. Flourishing between 1500 and 400 BCE along Mexico's Gulf Coast, the Olmecs were innovators, the first to build monumental pyramids, develop a written language, and carve those awe-inspiring colossal heads, each weighing up to 20 tons. Then, around 400 BCE, their great ceremonial centers La Venta, San Lorenzo, Tres Zapotes were systematically destroyed, not abandoned, not neglected, but deliberately torn apart. Who would dismantle their own sacred cities, and why? The clues lie in the ruins. At La Venta, the Olmec spiritual heart, archaeologists found evidence of a bizarre and violent farewell. Monumental sculptures were toppled, their faces smashed or buried. Altars were broken, their fragments scattered. Most haunting of all, the colossal heads, those basalt portraits of rulers with flattened noses and stern lips, were decapitated, some dragged for miles before being interred in lines as if in a funeral procession. This wasn't the work of invaders, the precision suggests ritual. The Olmecs, it seems, orchestrated their own civilization's funeral, but what could drive a people to erase their legacy? One theory points to environmental disaster. Sediment cores from the region reveal catastrophic flooding around 400 BCE, perhaps hurricanes or rising rivers that drowned crops and poisoned freshwater sources. Yet that doesn't fully explain the ritualized destruction. Another possibility, rebellion. The Olmecs thrived under a rigid hierarchy, with rulers depicted as near-divine in art. If famine or disaster shattered that faith, the people might have revolted, tearing down the symbols of a failed elite. Then there's the enigma of the heads themselves. Carved from single blocks of basalt hauled from quarries 50 miles away without wheels or pack animals, these marvels symbolize the Olmecs' reach and their vulnerability. When trade routes collapsed or allies turned enemies, maintaining such grandeur became impossible. The very stones that proclaimed their power may have become targets for defiance. Yet, like the Maya, the Olmecs didn't truly disappear. Their inventions, the ball game, the concept of zero, the jaguar god, echo through later Mesoamerican cultures. Their downfall wasn't an ending, but a metamorphosis. The heads buried at La Venta weren't just monuments, they were seeds, and from their silent reburial grew the civilizations that would remember them as the first mother, the culture that taught the others how to rise and perhaps when to let go. On the island of Crete, the Minoans built a civilization so dazzling that their legend echoes through time. A culture of labyrinthine palaces, bull-leaping athletes, and vibrant frescoes bursting with life. Yet by 1450 BCE, their world lay in ruins. What could topple a society so advanced that even the Greeks would later spin myths about King Minos and his monstrous minotaur? The answer lies in a perfect storm of disaster, one that began with fire and ended with silence. The first blow came from the sea. 30 miles north of Crete, the volcanic island of Thera detonated with a force 50 times greater than Krakatoa. Around 1600 BCE, the eruption sent tsunamis crashing into Crete's northern shores, flattening coastal towns and choking farmlands with ash. Frescoes at Akrotiri, a Minoan outpost on Thera, capture everyday life frozen in mid-sentence, fishermen hauling nets, antelopes leaping, before being entombed in volcanic rock. But while the eruption was catastrophic, it wasn't immediately fatal. The Minoans rebuilt, their palaces still standing. The true collapse came a century later, and this time the threat wasn't nature, it was human. Archaeologists sifting through the ashes of Knossos, the grandest Minoan palace, found something unsettling. Tablets written not in the elegant linear A script of the Minoans, but in Linear B, an early form of Greek. These weren't trade records, they were inventories of weapons, chariots, and slaves. The Mycenaeans, warlike rivals from mainland Greece, had seized control. Had they invaded, or had the Minoans, weakened by famine and fractured leadership, invited them in as mercenaries? The evidence suggests both. In the final days, Minoan art shifts from dolphins and lilies to scenes of armored warriors. The bull leapers were gone, the fighters had arrived, yet even conquest doesn't fully explain the silence that followed. The final clue lies in the ruins' layers, traces of fire. Not the random burns of war, but systematic destruction targeting the palace's central sanctuaries. The Minoans didn't just fall, they were erased, their religion dismantled. Was this a Mycenaean purge, or did the Minoans themselves, facing ecological collapse and lost faith in their gods, set the flames? The legacy they left is paradoxical. Their art influenced Greece, their maritime trade routes endured, but their language linear remains undeciphered, a whisper we can't quite hear. The Minoans teach us that collapse is rarely a single event, but a cascade, fire from the earth, blades from the sea, and finally, the quiet unraveling of a people who once danced with bulls. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro were once a marvel of urban planning, straight as arrows, lined with baked brick houses, and equipped with the world's first known sewage system. By 1900 BCE, this meticulously organized city, along with the rest of the Indus Valley civilization, was slipping into silence. No invading armies left scorch marks on their walls. No mass graves hinted at plague or slaughter. Instead, the people of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro simply walked away, leaving behind jewelry in workshops, toys in courtyards, and seals inscribed with a script we still can't read. What could make a society so advanced, one that stretched over 1 million square kilometers, pack up and vanish? The earth itself holds the first clues. Sediment cores drilled from the Gaga-Hakra riverbed, once thought to be the mythical Saraswati of ancient texts, reveal a startling shift. Around 2200 BCE, monsoon patterns began to weaken, starving the rivers that fed the Indus heartland. But the death blow came from tectonics. Geological evidence suggests earthquakes in the Himalayas rerouted entire river systems, turning fertile plains into cracked wasteland. At Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists found layers of silt piled atop abandoned neighborhoods, not from a single flood, but from relentless, smaller inundations that choked fields with salt. The Indus people were master hydrologists, but even they couldn't out-engineer a landscape in revolt. Yet climate alone doesn't explain the eerie orderliness of their retreat. Unlike other collapsed civilizations, there's no evidence of panic or violence. Instead, the cities show signs of a slow, deliberate withdrawal. At Harappa, later settlements were built directly atop the ruins, but with cruder bricks and haphazard layouts. It's as if knowledge itself was unraveling, the meticulous standards of the past fading like a forgotten language. Some researchers argue this points to a social implosion. As trade routes dried up and harvests failed, the centralized authority that maintained those perfect grids may have collapsed, scattering people into smaller, struggling villages. But here's the twist that haunts historians: the Indus script. Thousands of inscribed seals and tablets survive, bearing symbols that could unlock the mystery of their demise. Yet despite a century of effort, no one has deciphered them. Were they administrative records, prayers for rain? We don't know. Their voices are literally silent. What remains are physical traces, wheat grains found in storage rooms, their kernels shrunken from drought, children's toys abandoned mid-play, and the eerie uniformity of their cities where even the poorest homes had access to clean water. The legacy of the Indus Valley is a paradox, a civilization that mastered urban living 4,000 years ago only to leave without a whisper. Their disappearance wasn't dramatic, it was a slow turning away like a receding tide. Today, their descendants may walk among the billion people of South Asia, their bloodline mixed beyond recognition. But those empty streets still pose a question. When the water runs out and the earth shifts beneath your feet, what do you take with you and what do you leave behind? When the first European explorers stumbled upon the ruins of Anchor in the 19th century, they couldn't believe their eyes. Towering stone faces peered out from tangled roots and vast reservoirs stretched empty under the sun. This wasn't just a city, it was an entire hydraulic empire, a civilization that had mastered water on a scale unmatched in the medieval world. Yet by the 15th century, Angkor Wat's celestial spires stood silent. How could the Khmer Empire, with its million-strong capital and engineering marvels, vanish into the jungle? The answer lies in a paradox. The very system that sustained them ultimately sealed their fate. At its peak, Angkor was a metropolis built on liquid foundations. Canals zigzagged for miles, diverting monsoon rains into massive barrages, rectangular reservoirs holding billions of gallons. Farmers grew 3 rice crops a year, feeding a population comparable to London at the time. But tree rings from the region reveal a cruel twist: decades of erratic monsoons in the 14th century. The elaborate network of canals and sluices designed for predictable rains became a liability. Droughts left reservoirs barren, while violent downpours overwhelmed the system, flushing silt into vital channels. The Khmers had engineered perfection until the climate refused to cooperate. Yet nature wasn't working alone. Carvings at the Bayon Temple hint at another threat: the rise of Ayutthaya. This burgeoning Siamese kingdom to the west began launching raids not just for plunder but to cripple Angkor's lifelines. In 1371, chronicles describe Siamese forces sacking the city, targeting not palaces but infrastructure, smashing weirs, breaching dikes. Without functioning waterworks, Angkor's rice surplus evaporated, undermining the god-king's divine mandate. The empire's elite might have survived invasion, but they couldn't survive hunger. Archaeologists digging through Angkor's collapse have found poignant traces of this unraveling. In the city's final decades, repairs to canals grew slapdash using mismatched bricks. Sacred pools meant for ritual purification became crowded with mundane storage jars. Even temple carvings lost their precision, as if the artisans knew their world was slipping away. The last dated inscription from 1431 isn't a royal decree but a humble prayer for rain. But here's what makes the Khmer's disappearance so haunting: it wasn't total. Unlike vanished civilizations like the Olmec, the Khmer people endured. Many likely migrated southeast to Phnom Penh, adapting to maritime trade as inland agriculture failed. The empire didn't die, it pivoted, trading stone monuments for survival. Angkor's lesson isn't about collapse, it's about transformation. Even the mightiest cities are fleeting when the rains change and the rivers turn to dust. Standing on the rocky shores of Rapa Nui, you're surrounded by giants nearly 900 moe, those haunting stone figures gazing inland with hollow eyes. For centuries, their silent presence fed one of history's most enduring cautionary tales. A society so obsessed with statue building that they chopped down every last tree, triggering ecological doom. But what if this story, repeated in textbooks and documentaries, is wrong? The truth about Easter Island's collapse isn't about reckless extravagance, it's about resilience in the face of unimaginable pressures. The myth goes like this: Polynesians arrived around 1200 CE to a lush island teeming with palm forests. As rival clans competed to carve ever larger moai, they rolled the statues on wooden sledges, stripping the land bare. With no trees to anchor the soil, crops failed and cannibalism erupted. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the survivors were starving amid the ruins of their own hubris. It's a tidy morality play, except almost none of it holds up under scrutiny. Take the deforestation. Pollen studies confirm the island's palms vanished by 1650, but this wasn't mindless destruction. The Rapa Nui were adapting. With no native land mammals, they relied on seabirds for protein. As trees dwindled, they built ingenious stone gardens called manavai, circular windbreaks that trapped moisture, allowing crops to thrive in barren rock. And those iconic statues, later moai, weren't dragged. They were rocked upright in a laborious but timber-free process witnessed by oral traditions. The real culprit behind the ecological crisis, rats, Polynesian rodents, stowaways on canoes, devoured palm nuts faster than trees could regenerate. Then came the Europeans, not with enlightenment but with whips and smallpox. Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen's arrival in 1722 marked the beginning of the end. Within decades, slave raids from Peru carried off half the population. Survivors brought back diseases that ravaged the remaining communities. Christian missionaries banned traditional ceremonies, toppling moai as idolatrous. The Rapa Nui didn't collapse from within, they were dismantled from outside. Yet the most fascinating twist lies in the island's silent rebellion. After the moai were felled, the Rapa Nui invented something startling, the Tangata Monu or birdman cult. Each year, warriors would scale sheer cliffs to steal the first sooty tern egg of the season. The winner's clan gained temporary authority, a radical shift from ancestor worship to a meritocracy forged in crisis. Even as their world shattered, the Rapa Nui kept reinventing themselves. The lesson of Easter Island isn't one of ecological suicide. It's about a people who survived deforestation, slave raids, and cultural erasure, and still found ways to honor their past while adapting to an unrecognizable future. The moai weren't tombstones for a dead civilization. They were waypoints in a story of survival that continues today, whispered in the Rapa Nui language that schoolchildren are now learning anew. Beneath the modern skyline of St. Louis, a silent city lies buried, one that once rivaled medieval London in size. Cahokia, the heart of the Mississippian culture, boasted a population of 20,000 at its peak around 1100 CE. Its skyline dominated by Monk's Mound, an earthen pyramid larger at its base than Egypt's Great Pyramid. Yet by 1350, the grand plazas where chunky stones once rolled in ritual games stood empty. The mounds, once plastered brightly with clay, faded into the prairie grass. What could topple a civilization that had mastered agriculture, astronomy, and monumental construction centuries before European contact? The answer lies in a trio of threats: water, war, and a world growing colder. First, the floods. Core samples from nearby Horseshoe Lake tell a story of increasing chaos. Around 1200, the Mississippi began overflowing its banks with unusual violence, drowning crops in Cahokia's meticulously planned fields. The Mississippians were no strangers to seasonal floods. Their entire agricultural system relied on rich silt deposits, but these were different. Layers of sand in archaeological digs suggest torrents that ripped through neighborhoods, undermining the very mounds that held their temples. Some researchers believe deforestation played a role. The city's appetite for wood to build palisades and houses may have stripped stabilizing vegetation from the bluffs. When the waters came, there was nothing left to hold the soil. Then came the arrows. Excavations at Cahokia's stockades reveal a grim truth. These weren't just ceremonial walls. Post holes show repeated rebuilding, each version more fortified than the last. In one mass grave near Mound 72, archaeologists uncovered the bodies of 53 young women, their bones suggesting they'd been starved before execution. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated terror, perhaps from rival chiefdoms sensing weakness. The Mississippian world was fracturing, and Cahokia, once the undisputed center, found itself besieged from without and within. But the cruelest blow came from the sky, or rather, the lack of warmth from it. The onset of the Little Ice Age around 1300 brought shorter growing seasons and unpredictable frosts. For a culture dependent on maize, this was catastrophic. Paleoclimatologists studying tree rings have found evidence of back-to-back famines in the 14th century. Shell beads and copper ornaments, once traded as far as the Great Lakes, disappear from the archaeological record, suggesting trade networks collapsing like dominoes. Yet here's what makes Cahokia's disappearance so haunting. It wasn't abandonment but dispersal. Unlike Easter Island or Anchor, there was no single moment of exodus. Instead, people left in waves, joining smaller villages along tributaries where floods were less severe. Descendant cultures like the Chickasaw and Quapaw carry forward Mississippian traditions. The stomp dance, the reverence for mounds, proving that while the city died, its people adapted. The mounds still stand today, not as tombstones, but as testament to a civilization that chose survival over stone, scattering like seeds in the wind when the earth could no longer sustain their grandeur. The sandstone cliffs of Petra glow crimson at dawn, their facades carved with such precision that Roman historians later claimed the Nabateans must have been aided by gods. At its height, this desert metropolis thrived on an empire of incense and spice, its camel caravans weaving a web of trade from Arabia to the Mediterranean. Yet by the 4th century, Petra stood empty, its aqueducts dry, its treasury looted, and its grand tombs inhabited only by echoes. How does a civilization that mastered water harvesting in one of Earth's driest regions vanish into the very rock it sculpted? The answer lies not in a single catastrophe, but in the slow strangulation of trade and the irony of Roman progress. For centuries, the Nabateans' genius lay in their control of the incense route. They didn't just trade frankincense and myrrh, they weaponized geography. Their capital sat at a choke point where caravans had no choice but to pay exorbitant taxes. To survive the arid journey, traders relied on Petra's subterranean water channels, a network of cisterns and tunnels that captured every drop of sporadic rainfall. The city wasn't just beautiful, it was a hydraulic trap engineered to profit from thirst. Then came Rome. In 106 CE, Emperor Trajan annexed Petra, dazzled by its wealth but blind to its fragility. Roman engineers paved new roads bypassing the city, diverting trade to ports like Ayla on the Red Sea. The Nabateans had built an empire on scarcity. Rome believed in abundance. But the coup de grace came from an unexpected direction, the sea. By the 3rd century, Roman ships had mastered monsoon winds, sailing directly from Egypt to India. Suddenly, spices bypassed the overland routes entirely. Petra's taxes evaporated like mirages. Archaeologists find evidence of desperate adaptation. Tombs converted into homes, temples repurposed for olive pressing. The final blow was seismic. In 363 CE, an earthquake shattered Petra's dams and pipelines. Without trade wealth to fund repairs, the water system failed. The desert, held at bay for centuries, crept back in. Yet the Nabateans didn't so much vanish as scatter. Their cursive script evolved into Arabic, their hydraulic knowledge passed to Islamic engineers. Even Petra's abandonment wasn't absolute. Byzantine monks later scribbled crosses on tomb walls, and Bedouin tribes sheltered in the caves. The city's true disappearance was a European invention. Swiss explorer Johann Burckhardt had to disguise himself as a Muslim scholar in 1812 to rediscover what locals had never forgotten. Petra's lesson is stark. Civilizations don't always fall to war or climate. Sometimes they're simply rendered irrelevant, left to fade into the cliffs when the world decides to take a different road. 12,000 years ago, across the vast expanse of Ice Age North America, a culture emerged with tools so distinctive they'd become a time capsule: fluted spear points, razor-sharp and deadly, designed to take down mammoths and mastodons. These were the Clovis people, the continent's first widespread culture, their artifacts found from coast to coast. Then, in what seems like a geological blink, they vanished. Their elegant spear points stop appearing in the archaeological record, and the megafauna they hunted, woolly mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, disappear alongside them. What could obliterate an entire way of life so abruptly? The answer might lie not in the earth but in the sky. Theories about the Clovis disappearance read like a disaster movie script. Around 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas period struck, a sudden, brutal return to Ice Age conditions after centuries of warming. Pollen records show forests retreating, grasslands withering, but the kicker, a layer of sediment from that time, found at over 50 sites across the continent, contains exotic materials, nanodiamonds, melted glass, and iridium, all telltale signs of an extraterrestrial impact. The controversial Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a comet or meteorite exploded in the atmosphere, triggering wildfires, collapsing ecosystems, and possibly decimating the Clovis population in a single catastrophic event. Yet not all scientists are convinced. Some argue the evidence is circumstantial and that the Clovis decline was more gradual, a victim of their own success. Their hunting prowess may have contributed to the megafauna extinctions, leaving them without prey as the climate shifted. Others point to volcanic activity or changes in ocean currents disrupting weather patterns. What's undeniable is the scale of the transformation. What makes the Clovis mystery so compelling isn't just their disappearance, but what followed, or rather, what didn't. For centuries, their technology was unrivaled. Then, nothing. Later cultures used cruder points as if knowledge itself had been fragmented. But here's the twist. Genetic studies reveal Clovis descendants among modern indigenous groups, proving they didn't vanish entirely. Their legacy endured, even as their way of life dissolved into the upheaval of a changing world. The Clovis remind us that even the most adaptable cultures can be undone by forces beyond their control, whether from the stars or the ice that once defined their world. Deep in the marshlands of southwestern Spain, where the Guadalquivir River meets the Atlantic, lies the ghost of a civilization that once dazzled the ancient world, the Tartessos. By the 6th century BCE, this wealthy kingdom of metalworkers and seafarers had vanished so completely that later Greek historians questioned whether it had ever existed at all. Their cities, described as gleaming with silver and bronze, sank into the mud without a trace. The only clues, a handful of ornate gold jewelry, a few inscribed stones, and whispers from distant cultures who remembered them as masters of the mythical Silver Mountain. So how does an entire civilization, one rich enough to trade with Phoenicians and Greeks, simply dissolve into legend? The Tartessos' story begins with Earth's treasures. Their territory overlapped with what's now one of Europe's largest copper and silver deposits, the Rio Tinto mines. Ancient texts describe Tartessian rulers gifting silver bowls to Phoenician traders, their ports bustling with tin from Cornwall and amber from the Baltic. But wealth attracts trouble. By 500 BCE, Phoenician colonies like Gadea, modern Cadiz, began encroaching on Tartessian trade routes. Evidence of burned warehouses and hastily rebuilt walls suggests violent clashes. Yet conflict alone doesn't explain the scale of their disappearance. Here's where geology paints a darker picture. Core samples from the Guadalquivir estuary reveal layers of marine sediment dating to roughly the same period, a telltale sign of tsunamis. Greek accounts mention great waves swallowing coastal cities around this time, possibly triggered by an undersea landslide near the Strait of Gibraltar. For the Tartessos, whose low-lying capital may have been built on wetlands, such an event would have been apocalyptic. Imagine entire districts submerged, saltwater poisoning farmlands, and surviving merchants fleeing inland. But perhaps the most haunting theory involves not force but assimilation. Tartessian artifacts show heavy Phoenician influence in their final years. their script adapting Phoenician letters, their gods merging with foreign deities. Some scholars argue they didn't so much vanish as culturally evaporate, their identity diluted by generations of intermarriage and economic dependence. Their language, once written on stele, survives only in fragments that linguists still struggle to decipher. The Tartessos leave us with a paradox, a civilization celebrated by Homer and Herodotus, yet one that left barely a footprint in the land they once ruled. Their fate whispers a warning about the fragility of identity, how even the mightiest cultures can be undone by a shifting tide, whether of water, war, or simply the slow erosion of time. High in the misty peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, the Yuchai people tell stories of their ancient neighbors, the moon-eyed people, a pale-skinned tribe said to have navigated the forests by moonlight, their eyes unable to bear the sun's glare. These mysterious figures, described in Cherokee and Creek oral traditions as master builders of stone fortifications, vanish from the historical record long before European contact, leaving behind terraced mounds and geometric earthworks that still puzzle archaeologists. Were they a separate civilization or an early branch of the Yuchai themselves? And what force could have erased them so completely that even their name is borrowed from the legends of others? The moon-eyed people's legacy is etched into the landscape. At sites like Fort Mountain in Georgia, walls of stacked stone stretch for hundreds of feet along ridgelines too precise to be natural, yet too ancient to fit neatly into known Native American building traditions. Early European settlers stumbling upon these structures attributed them to lost Welsh explorers or even pre-Columbian Vikings. But carbon dating tells a different story. These walls predate Columbus by centuries, possibly even millennia. The Yuchai, who claim ancestral ties to the builders, describe them as a peaceful people who retreated underground or westward after conflicts with incoming tribes. Yet no skeletal remains, no artifacts bearing their unique craftsmanship have ever been definitively linked to them. Here's where the mystery deepens. In the 1700s, naturalist William Bartram recorded Cherokee elders speaking of the moon-eyed people as no longer existing, but their stories suggested something stranger than mere conquest. Some tales describe them as nocturnal artisans, emerging only under cover of darkness to shape the land. Others speak of a sudden, collective blindness, a curse or disease that left them vulnerable to displacement. Modern scholars offer quieter theories. Perhaps they were an early offshoot of the Yuchai or Cadone peoples, assimilated so thoroughly that only their structures endured. Or maybe they represent a cultural memory of the Adena or Hopewell, mound-building cultures whose influence once stretched across the eastern woodlands. The most haunting clue lies in the Yuchai language itself. Unlike their Muskogean-speaking neighbors, the Yuchai's tongue is a linguistic isolate unrelated to any other known language group. Some anthropologists see this as a whisper of their possible connection to the moon-eyed people, a last thread tying them to a lost world. Today, the Yuchai fight to preserve their identity, their oral traditions keeping alive the enigma of those who walked the mountains before them. The stone walls remain silent and steadfast, as if waiting for the moon to rise, and for the people who built them to step back into the light. The Moche civilization thrived along Peru's arid coast, their adobe pyramids rising like giants from the desert, their walls adorned with vivid murals of gods, warriors, and sinister rituals. By 800 CE, these master artisans known for golden death masks and ceramic portraits so lifelike they seemed to breathe, had vanished, their grand ceremonial centers buried under layers of silt. Their downfall wasn't sudden, but a slow suffocation caught between the fury of the skies and the unraveling of their own beliefs. Start with the rain. The Moche inhabited one of the driest places on Earth, yet their survival depended on precise, seasonal downpours from the Andes. Then came the deluges, not gentle storms, but monstrous El Niño events that turned rivers into torrents. At the Huaca de la Luna, archaeologists found evidence of repeated flooding. Walls toppled, plazas choked with mud, and layers of sand suggesting entire neighborhoods were swallowed. But the real horror lies deeper. In one flood deposit, they uncovered the skeletons of dozens of young men, their bones showing signs of ritual sacrifice. The Moch, it seems, responded to disaster by doubling down on their darkest traditions, offering more blood to gods who'd stopped listening. Yet climate alone doesn't explain their collapse. The Moch weren't just victims of nature, they were architects of their own fragility. Their society revolved around a divine elite rulers who claimed to control the weather and harvest. When those promises broke, so did the covenant between leaders and people. At the site of Galindo, a fortress-like city built in the civilization's final century, archaeologists see signs of rebellion. Temples defaced, elite residences burned, and a stark shift from intricate art to cruder, mass-produced pottery. The Moch's artistic brilliance, once a unifying force, had become a luxury they could no longer afford. Then there's the eerie silence of the tombs. In Sipan, where royal burials once glittered with gold and turquoise, later graves hold only broken shells and faded textiles. The trade routes that brought lapis lazuli from Chile and emeralds from Colombia had snapped, leaving the Moch isolated. Even their iconography changed. The proud warrior priests of earlier murals were replaced by figures with downcast eyes, as if the culture itself had lost its nerve. But here's the twist: the Moch didn't disappear without heirs. Centuries later, the Chimu and Inca would adopt their irrigation techniques and metallurgy, proving their legacy outlasted their cities. The Moch's real lesson isn't about collapse, it's about the peril of staking everything on a system too rigid to bend. When the rains came and the gods fell silent, their world dissolved like the adobe bricks of their pyramids, returning to the earth from which it came. In the heart of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire once stood as a colossus of the Bronze Age, its chariots feared from Egypt to Mesopotamia, its laws etched in cuneiform on clay tablets. Yet by 1180 BCE, their capital Hattusa lay in ashes, its massive stone gates torn from their hinges. This wasn't just the fall of a kingdom, it was the unraveling of an entire era. The Hittites' disappearance marks one of history's most dramatic collapses, where drought, invasion, and a shadowy coalition known only as the Sea Peoples conspired to topple a superpower almost overnight. Start with the land itself. Tree rings from that period tell a story of relentless drought, 300 years of unstable climate known as the Bronze Age collapse. For the Hittites, whose grain stores fed armies and whose treaties were sealed with shipments of wheat, this was catastrophic. Tablets from Hattusa's final days beg Egypt for emergency grain. "Our land is dying," one reads, "send ships before it's too late." But Egypt, facing its own crises, never replied. The Hittite king's desperation is palpable. These weren't the words of a declining empire, but one caught in a stranglehold of ecological chaos. Yet nature didn't act alone. Just as famine weakened the Hittites, a wave of destruction swept across the Mediterranean. Ancient texts speak of the Sea Peoples, mercenaries or migrants from the Aegean who sacked cities with terrifying efficiency. At Hattusa, archaeologists found evidence of hurried abandon. Unfinished statues, unburied bodies, and clay tablets baked hard by fire, preserving their final pleas. The Sea Peoples left no inscriptions, no cities of their own. They appear in history as phantoms, their origins and motives still debated. Were they climate refugees, professional raiders, or both? The Hittites called them simply enemies from the sea, a nameless terror that arrived as their granaries emptied. But here's what makes the Hittite collapse so haunting: it wasn't total. In southern Anatolia and Syria, Neo-Hittite city-states like Carchemish survived for centuries, blending Hittite traditions with Aramean culture. Their art depicts old Hittite gods wearing new faces, and their rulers still invoked the titles of Hattusa's kings like echoes of a fallen dynasty. Even the language persisted. Hieroglyphic Luwian, once the empire's second script, outlived cuneiform by generations. the empire didn't so much vanish as shatter, its pieces melting into the civilizations that followed. The lesson of the Hittites isn't just about vulnerability. It's about how interconnected the ancient world truly was, how a drought in Anatolia could starve armies in Egypt, and how mysterious mariners could ignite a domino effect of collapse. When Hattusa burned, it took with it the Bronze Age's delicate balance of power. But from its ashes rose new kingdoms, proving that even the mightiest empires are chapters, not endpoints, in humanity's unending story. For 500 years, the Norse clung to Greenland's icy shores, farmers in furs tending cattle in a world of glaciers. These Vikings, descendants of Eric the Red's bold settlers, built stone churches, traded walrus ivory with Europe, and carved runes whispering of daily life. Then, by 1500, their villages stood empty. No battle cries, no mass graves, just abandoned longhouses slowly buried under snow. How did these rugged survivors, who'd thrived in Greenland's harsh embrace, vanish without a trace? The answer lies in a perfect storm of fading warmth, fraying connections, and a culture that refused to adapt. The first blow came from the sky. When the Norse arrived in 985, Greenland was in the throes of the medieval warm period, a climatic sweet spot where pastures grew lush and fjords stayed ice-free long enough for supply ships from Norway. But by 1350, the Little Ice Age began its grip. Core samples from Greenland's ice sheet revealed plummeting temperatures, with growing seasons shortening by weeks. The Norse, stubbornly European to their core, kept planting barley and herding cattle, animals that gnawed at already stressed grasslands until the soil gave out. Meanwhile, their Inuit neighbors thrived, hunting seals through ice the Norse deemed too treacherous. Archaeologists find Norse bones stunted by malnutrition, while Inuit middens overflow with bones of marine mammals. One culture saw the sea as salvation, the other as a barrier. Isolation strangled them next, as Europe's demand for walrus ivory waned, replaced by African elephant tusks. Ships from Norway grew rare. A fragment of a 1424 letter from the Pope laments no contact with Greenland for years. The last recorded ship arrived in 1410, finding the western settlement already abandoned. Cut off from timber, iron, and reinforcements, the Norse doubled down on tradition. They wore European wool in blizzards while the Inuit dressed in sealskin. They starved beside seas teeming with fish their religion forbade them to eat during Lent. At a farmstead in the eastern settlement, archaeologists uncovered the bones of a hunting dog, its ribs showing knife marks, a grim testament to desperation. Then there were the Skraelings, the Norse term for the Inuit. Early encounters were tentative trades, Norse metal for Inuit pelts, but as resources dwindled, tensions flared. Inuit oral histories tell of conflicts, and Norse artifacts found in Inuit camps suggest raids. At Sandnes, a Norse homestead, arrowheads of meteoric iron, a material only the Inuit worked, were lodged in charred roof beams. The Vikings, once terrorizers of Europe, had become the vulnerable. Yet the cruelest twist lies in what they left behind. In 1492, a papal envoy sailing past Greenland's coast reported seeing no smoke, no boats, only silence. The last written record from the colony itself is a marriage contract from 1408. By the time Danish explorers arrived in the 1700s, they found only ruins and a single chilling clue: the skeleton of a man lying face down near the shore, his boots still on. He'd been running toward the sea, perhaps chasing a ship that never came, or fleeing something worse. The Greenland Norse didn't just fade away, they were erased by their own refusal to change, a cautionary tale written in ice and bone. High on the arid plains of the Andes, the stone faces of Tiwanaku's Gate of the Sun stare endlessly across Lake Titicaca, their hollow eyes guarding secrets of an empire that once fed 500,000 people in a land where rain was as rare as gold. By 1000 CE, this city of celestial calendars and monolithic temples stood abandoned, its fields fallow, its canals choked with dust. The Tiwanaku didn't just fade, they unraveled in a slow-motion collapse that serves as a masterclass in how even the most ingenious civilizations can be undone by the very systems that sustain them. At its peak, Tiwanaku's engineers performed miracles with water. In a region where frosts could strike any night of the year, they sculpted the landscape into raised fields called sukakolis, grids of soil mounds surrounded by irrigation channels that acted like thermal batteries. Water absorbed the sun's heat by day, releasing it at night to protect crops from freezing. Their yields were staggering, enough quinoa and potatoes to feed cities while most of Europe still farmed subsistence plots. Then, around 950 CE, sediment cores from Lake Titicaca tell a chilling story. A drought lasting 40 years, the lake, their lifeblood, shrank by half. The sukakolis baked dry, their delicate thermal balance shattered. Starvation gnawed at the empire's bones, but drought alone doesn't explain the violence etched into Tiwanaku's final days. Excavations reveal hastily built defensive walls cutting through ceremonial plazas, their stones scavenged from temples. Skeletons show blunt force trauma, their skulls crushed by maces unlike Tiwanaku's own weapons. Enter the Aymara pastoralists from the drier southern Altiplano, long marginalized by Tiwanaku's dominance. As the empire weakened, Aymara oral histories speak of a great uprising, of burning storehouses and toppling monoliths. Archaeologists find Aymara-style pottery layered atop Tiwanaku ruins, but without the grandeur, a culture not inheriting the empire but overwriting it. Yet the most haunting clue lies in the ruins themselves. The Tiwanaku didn't just abandon their city, they ritually killed it. At the Akapana pyramid, offerings of smashed ceramics and dismembered llama fetuses were placed in the drained reservoirs, a final plea to gods who'd turned away. The empire's collapse wasn't just ecological or military, it was spiritual. When the priest's prayers for rain failed, the people's faith curdled into despair. But here's the twist: Tiwanaku's legacy outlasted its empire. The Inca, arriving centuries later, would adopt their agricultural techniques and claim the ruins as a sacred birthplace. Today, Aymara farmers still use modified sukakolis, proving that while empires fall, ingenuity endures. The stone faces of Tiwanaku now watch over a different world, one that remembers not their downfall but the brilliance that made their rise possible. For 3 centuries, the Scythians ruled the Eurasian steppe like shadows on horseback, their gold-tipped arrows piercing the nightmares of Persia and Greece, their tattooed chieftains drinking from skull cups as they galloped between the Black Sea and Mongolia. Then, by the 2nd century CE, these masters of the saddle vanished from history's stage, their name fading like hoofprints in tall grass. But this wasn't the abrupt collapse of settled empires. It was the slow bleed of a nomadic culture dissolving into the tides of migration and war. The Scythians' decline began with a paradox. Their greatest strength became their Achilles' heel. Their decentralized, clan-based society let them strike like windstorms and vanish just as quickly, but it left them vulnerable when new horsemen rode west. Enter the Sarmatians, fellow nomads armed with longer lances and laminated armor. Greek historians like Strabo describe a brutal succession, Sarmatian tribes pushing the Scythians from the lush pastures north of the Black Sea, forcing them into the Crimean foothills. Archaeologists find Scythian kurgan burials from this period filled with hastily arranged graves, their famous gold finery replaced by cruder ornaments. These weren't the tombs of kings, but of a people clinging to fading glory. Yet conquest tells only half the story. The Scythians didn't just lose territory, they lost their economic lifeline. For centuries, they'd grown rich as middlemen on the Silk Road's northern branch, trading furs and slaves for Chinese silk and Greek wine. But as Rome and Parthia stabilized their borders, new trade routes bypassed the steppe. Excavations at Scythian trading posts like Kamianka reveal layers of charred grain silos, proof of how brittle their prosperity had become. A people who'd once shaken empires now bartered for survival. Then came the Goths. By 200 CE, these Germanic migrants began crossing the steppe, bringing iron swords and a hunger for land. The Scythians, caught between Sarmatians and Goths, faced a choice: fight or merge. Some clans chose resistance. At a battlefield near the Dnieper River, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave of Scythian warriors buried alongside Gothic-style brooches, a grim testament to their last stand. Others assimilated. DNA studies of later Sarmatian graves show genetic markers linking them to Scythian lineages, suggesting many simply swapped loyalties, trading their leopard skin cloaks for Sarmatian dragon-headed banners. What's haunting is how thoroughly the Scythians were erased. Unlike the Hittites or Maya, they left no cities to rediscover, no scripts to decipher, just echoes in the cultures that swallowed them. Herodotus' tales of their hemp-filled funeral rites became campfire legends. Their animal-style art lived on in medieval Slavic motifs. Even their name became a ghost. Later chroniclers would call any steppe rider Scythian, blurring the line between memory and myth. Their true legacy lies deeper in the DNA of modern Ukrainians and Kazakhs, and in the unbroken tradition of horseback warfare that shaped empires from Attila to Genghis Khan. The Scythians didn't so much disappear as become the wind itself, invisible, but still shaping everything it touches. 5,000 years before the pyramids rose in Egypt, the Cucuteni Tripilia people built sprawling settlements across Eastern Europe, some stretching over 300 hectares, their concentric rings of houses holding thousands. These weren't primitive villages, they were metropolises of the Neolithic world, their clay-plastered homes adorned with spiral motifs, their ovens baking bread while most of humanity still hunted and gathered. Then, around 3,500 BCE, something extraordinary happened. The people torched their own cities, leaving behind layers of ash and a mystery that still smolders beneath Ukraine's black soil. What could drive a civilization to systematically burn down everything they'd built, not once but repeatedly over centuries? The first clue lies in the fires themselves. At sites like Talyinki and Nebelivka, archaeologists find not random destruction but precise, ritualized burning. Homes were emptied of valuables before being set alight, their timber frames collapsing in controlled infernos that left walls standing just tall enough to serve as foundations for new buildings. This wasn't disaster, it was tradition. Some researchers believe the Cucuteni Tripilia saw fire as purification, a cyclical rebirth echoing the seasons. But if burning was routine, why did they eventually stop rebuilding? Soil samples tell a darker story. These were agricultural pioneers, their wheat fields feeding populations denser than medieval London's. Yet pollen studies show their once rich lower soils became exhausted, choked by generations of relentless farming. The forests they cleared for timber never regrew, leaving the landscape stripped. At the same time, animal bones shift from wild game to almost exclusively domesticated cattle, a diet growing monotonous as ecosystems faltered. The people didn't just burn their homes, they may have been burning through their future. Then there are the figurines, thousands of them, mostly female, some with exaggerated hips and breasts, others with faces eerily blank. Were they goddesses or ancestors? Guardians of fertility or tokens of desperation? In the final settlement layers, these statues multiply even as pottery quality declines, as if the people were pleading with unseen forces. A haunting discovery at the Vadastra site offers a possible answer: a mass grave of children buried beneath a collapsed house, their bones showing signs of malnutrition. Yet the most compelling theory isn't collapse, it's transformation. Genetic studies reveal Cucuteni Tripilia DNA in later Bronze Age cultures like the Yamnaya. Rather than vanishing, they may have joined the Great Steppe migrations, trading settled life for nomadic pastoralism. Their spiral motifs reappear on Bronze Age pottery, their baking techniques preserved in later bread ovens. The fires that consumed their cities didn't end their story. They scattered embers across Europe where they glowed anew in other hands. The Cucuteni tripilia challenge our idea of disappearance. Sometimes a culture doesn't die. It simply changes shape like clay in the kiln, becoming something both familiar and utterly new. 5,000 years ago, where the Yangtze River meets the East China Sea, the Liangzhu people built a civilization that glimmered with jade, axes, discs, and pendants carved with such precision they seemed touched by the divine. Their canals crisscrossed rice paddies like liquid lace, their elite lived in platforms raised above floodwaters, and their artisans crafted tools from black pottery so thin it rang like bronze when struck. Then, around 2300 BCE, this jade kingdom dissolved into the marshes, leaving behind silent altars and waterways choked with silt. The Liangzhu didn't just fade, they were swallowed by a catastrophe written not in fire but in water. Beneath the ruins, the earth tells a story of drowning. Sediment cores drilled from Liangzhu's heart reveal a layer of clay so thick it suggests floods of biblical proportions, not seasonal overflows, but a deluge lasting decades. Pollen samples shift abruptly from rice and peach blossoms to wetland reeds, as if the land itself forgot how to be fertile. At the Mojioshan Palace complex, archaeologists uncovered a grim tableau. Skeletons still clutching jade by discs, their bones jumbled in debris flows as though caught mid-ritual when the waters came. These weren't careless builders, their hydraulic systems had weathered centuries of monsoons. This was something worse, the culprit, a perfect storm of climate upheaval. Ice cores from Tibet show the Asian monsoon system faltered around this time, while stalagmites in caves near Liangzhu bear chemical signatures of unprecedented rainfall. But here's the twist, it wasn't just rain. Geological surveys suggest a massive landslide in the upper Yangtze, possibly triggered by an earthquake, dammed the river temporarily before bursting. The resulting floodwave would have been a wall of water taller than Liangzhu's 10-meter-tall city walls, scouring everything in its path. Imagine it. A civilization that mastered water meeting water it couldn't master. Yet the most haunting evidence lies in what the Liangzhu left behind, or rather, what they didn't. Unlike other collapsed cultures, there's no sign of invasion, no layers of ash from sacked temples. Their jade workshops were abandoned mid-carving, half-finished ornaments left on benches as if workers expected to return. At the vast Fanshan cemetery, elite tombs from the final years contain fewer grave goods, their jade Kong tubes snapped in halves, a ritual act of termination, as if the nobles knew their lineage was ending. Even their writing, a series of pictographs etched on pottery, stops abruptly, leaving behind sentences no one can now read. But the Liangzhu's legacy flows deeper than the Yangtze's mud. Their rice terraces became the blueprint for East Asian agriculture. Their jade iconography, those spirals and masks, reappears centuries later in Shang dynasty art. Modern DNA studies trace their bloodline through contemporary Jiangsu fishermen, proving the people endured even as their civilization sank beneath the silt. The lesson of Liangzhu isn't just about collapse, it's about how cultures dissolve into the land that birthed them, leaving behind stones that outlast empires and whispers that outrun the flood. High in the rugged highlands of northern Ethiopia, the ruins of Axum whisper of an empire that once traded with Rome and minted its own gold coins. By the 10th century, this kingdom, home to towering obelisks and the legendary Ark of the Covenant, had crumbled into silence. Unlike other collapses marked by fire and sword, Axum's decline was a slow erosion, both of the land beneath its feet and the trade routes that once filled its coffers. Here, the earth itself turned traitor, and the tides of commerce shifted beyond its grasp. The first cracks in Axum's foundation were literal. Centuries of intensive farming on the highland plateaus stripped the soil of nutrients, while deforestation left the slopes vulnerable to relentless erosion. Terraces meant to trap fertile silt instead channeled rainwater into gullying torrents, carving wounds into the landscape that still scar Ethiopia today. Archaeologists digging through Axum's late-period layers find thinner pottery walls and smaller livestock bones, signs of a society tightening its belt as harvests dwindled. But the cruelest twist lay in the empire's greatest pride, its monumental stelae. These towering obelisks, some weighing hundreds of tons, required vast timber sledges to transport. By the time the last one was erected around the 4th century, the surrounding forests had been reduced to scrub. The very symbols of Axum's power hastened its ecological undoing. Yet nature wasn't the only force at work. For centuries, Axum thrived as the middleman between the Mediterranean and India, its Red Sea port of Adulis bustling with spices, ivory, and glass. Then came the rise of Islam in the 7th century, transforming the trade map almost overnight. Muslim merchants established direct sea routes from Arabia to India, bypassing Axum entirely. Coins minted in the empire's final decades tell the story. Once thick with gold, they grew lighter, debased with copper, until they disappeared altogether. A diplomatic snub from Constantinople in the 9th century sealed Axum's isolation, the final stroke for a kingdom that had once corresponded with emperors as an equal. But here's what makes Axum's disappearance so haunting. It wasn't oblivion but retreat. Unlike the Maya or Hittites, Axum's rulers didn't flee or fall in battle. They simply packed up their court and moved southward, shifting their capital to the rugged mountains of Lasta. The obelisk still stood, but the power had drained away like the soil from those wasted fields. The dynasty survived, evolving into the Zagwe kings and later the Solomonic line, but the imperial glory was gone. The lesson of Axum lies in its quiet unraveling. No invading armies, no apocalyptic drought, just 1,000 small betrayals by the land and the tides of commerce. Its obelisks remain, fingers of stone pointing at an empty sky, as if asking why the world moved on without them. The stone walls of Choco Canyon rise from the New Mexico desert like the ribs of some ancient beast, meticulously stacked, aligned to celestial events and utterly empty by the mid-12th century. Here, the ancestral Puebloans built a ceremonial hub unlike anything else in North America. Great houses with hundreds of rooms, solar and lunar observatories carved into cliff faces, and a network of arrow-straight roads radiating across 60,000 square miles of unforgiving terrain. Then, around 1150 CE, the last fire was banked, the last corn kernel stored, and the people walked away from their masterpiece. What could make a culture abandon the very heart of its spiritual and political universe? The answer lies in a web of drought, ambition, and the fragile threads that hold societies together. Start with the sky. Choco was built in a land where rain was as precious as turquoise, where the ancestral Puebloans engineered reservoirs and checked dams to harness every drop. Tree rings from the 11th century tell a story of reliable monsoons, decades of plenty that allowed the canyon to flourish. Then, around 1130, the pattern broke. The rains faltered, then failed entirely. Layers of sand in Kiva fire pits speak of choking dust storms, while turkey bones from late-period trash middens show butcher marks growing increasingly desperate. The great houses, designed to store surplus grain for lean years, stood half-empty. But Choco wasn't just a survival hub, it was a pilgrimage center, a place where distant clans gathered for ceremonies under those meticulously aligned roofs. Isotope studies of timber beams reveal something astonishing. Many were hauled from mountain ranges 50 miles away, carried without wheels or pack animals. The scale of labor was staggering, the social coordination even more so. Then, as drought bit deeper, the system strained. Archaeologists find fewer exotic goods, macaw feathers from Mexico, seashells from California, in later layers. The roads that once pulsed with pilgrims fell into disuse, their purpose fading like the memory of a dream. Here's where the story twists. Choco's collapse wasn't chaos, it was deliberate. At Pueblo Bonito, the grandest great house, researchers uncovered sealed doorways and ritually closed kivas, some with offerings of unbroken pottery left inside. This wasn't panicked flight, it was ceremonial leave-taking, as if the people were putting their world to bed. Yet the most haunting clue lies in the bones. Studies of skeletal remains show signs of escalating violence, skull fractures, arrow points embedded in vertebrae. Not warfare on the scale of the Maya's final days, but enough to suggest a fraying social contract. When the rains failed and the granaries emptied, the bonds between Choco's far-flung communities may have snapped under the strain. What happened next defies the myth of disappearance. The ancestral Pueblones didn't vanish, they redistributed. Some clans migrated northwest to places like Mesa Verde, where cliff dwellings offered natural insulation against drought. Others headed south, joining existing villages along the Rio Grande. Their legacy persists in modern Pueblo cultures, from Hopi Katina rituals to Zuni clan structures, proving that while stone walls may be abandoned, knowledge endures. The mystery of Choco isn't why it was left behind, but how it was built in the first place, a testament to what humans can achieve in the harshest places and what they must relinquish when the earth itself withdraws its gifts. Across the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, the Lapita people left behind a trail of broken pottery, red-slipped shards stamped with intricate designs, scattered from Papua New Guinea to Tonga like breadcrumbs, leading to one of history's most audacious migrations. By 500 BCE, these master navigators who had tamed the world's largest ocean vanished from the archaeological record. But their disappearance wasn't failure, it was transformation, a melting away into the cultures they birthed across the sea. The Lapita's story begins with fire and clay. Their distinct pottery, decorated with tooth-like stamps and intricate geometric patterns, acts as a fingerprint across 3,000 kilometers of islands. At the Tiauma site in Vanuatu, archaeologists uncovered a burial ground where Lapita elites were interred with pots from distant archipelagos, proof of a vast maritime network thriving over 3,000 years ago. These weren't accidental drift voyagers, they were calculated explorers steering double-hulled canoes by stars and swells, carrying live pigs, breadfruit saplings, and the very foundations of future Polynesian societies. Then suddenly the pottery stops, no more stamped designs, no more kilns, just silence in the sand. Climate whispers part of the answer. Core samples from Pacific atolls show a period of intensified El Niño activity around 500 BCE, erratic currents, longer droughts, and stronger storms that would have made long-distance voyaging perilous. But the Lapita didn't just shrink from the challenge, they adapted. On Tocopia, a speck of an island in the Solomons, researchers found evidence of a radical shift. The later layers show no pottery at all, but instead earth ovens and pit fermentation for breadfruit, a move toward self-sufficiency when trading networks frayed. The Lapita didn't vanish, they went local, trading clay for sustainability. Yet the most compelling evidence lies in language and DNA. Modern Polynesian tongues, from Hawaiian to Maori, trace back to Proto-Oceanic, the linguistic root of the Lapita. Genetic studies reveal their ancestral markers in virtually all Polynesian populations, proving they didn't die out. They became the very people who would later settle Easter Island, Hawaii, and New Zealand. Their legacy is written in the stars, the same constellations their descendants used to navigate thousands of years later, following paths the Lapita first carved into the waves. What looks like disappearance is really evolution. The Lapita's pottery may have faded, but their courage, their crops, and their celestial wisdom sailed on. They didn't leave ruins, they left a blueprint, one still guiding canoes across the Pacific today. In the windswept deserts of China's Tarim Basin, the dead refuse to stay silent. Here, buried in the rust-colored sands, lie mummies with flaxen hair, high cheekbones, and woven woolen garments dyed vivid red and blue, faces frozen in time, unmistakably Caucasian. These aren't medieval travelers or misplaced European explorers. They're relics of a thriving Bronze Age culture that flourished 4,000 years ago, a people so far from their genetic homeland that their very existence rewrites our understanding of ancient migration. By the 2nd millennium BCE, their oasis settlements lay abandoned, their language lost, their identity erased by the shifting sands and the tides of history. How did these outsiders carve out a life in one of Asia's harshest landscapes, and what forces conspired to wipe them from memory? The mummies first came to light in the early 20th century, when European archaeologists stumbled upon them near the oasis town of Lulan. The best preserved, the so-called Beauty of Lulan, wore a felt hat and leather boots, her auburn hair still braided, her lips parted as if whispering secrets to the wind. Carbon dating placed her at 1800 BCE, a contemporary of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. But it was the textiles that baffled researchers. Twilled woolen cloaks woven in patterns identical to those found in Bronze Age Austria, and tartan-like fabric resembling Celtic designs. DNA analysis later confirmed the unthinkable. These people shared ancestry with Yamnaya herders from the Pontic steppe, thousands of miles to the west. They hadn't wandered into the Tarim by accident. They'd journeyed there deliberately, crossing mountains and deserts to build a world of their own, and what a world it was. At the site of Zio, archaeologists uncovered a necropolis unlike anything else in Asia. Hundreds of boat-shaped coffins resting on wooden poles, their occupants buried with tiny sacks of ephedra, a stimulant still used in traditional medicine. The coffins themselves were masterpieces of carpentry, carved from single poplar trunks and sealed with ox hides, all facing westward as if pointing toward some forgotten homeland. These weren't nomads eking out survival. They were settlers with a sophisticated understanding of metallurgy, agriculture, and water management. Pollen studies reveal they cultivated wheat and millet in fields irrigated by glacial meltwater, while their cemeteries yielded bronze mirrors and horsehair bridles, luxuries suggesting trade networks stretching across Eurasia. Yet by 1500 BCE, the boats stopped sailing into the afterlife. The graves grow fewer, then vanish entirely. The culprit, a perfect storm of ecological and cultural shifts. Core samples from nearby Lop Nur show the Tarim's rivers began drying up, their life-giving waters retreating as glaciers shrank in the Tian Shan Mountains. At the same time, new peoples arrived, the ancestors of today's Uyghurs and Kazakhs, pastoralists from the east who brought with them horses, iron, and a different way of life. The Tarim people, already isolated, may have been absorbed, displaced, or simply outbred. The final twist lies in their linguistic ghost. Some scholars believe the Tarim mummies spoke Tocharian, a now extinct Indo-European language deciphered from Buddhist manuscripts found centuries later in the same region. If true, it means these blue-eyed wanderers preserved their tongue long after their culture faded, a whisper of their presence lingering in monastery scrolls, waiting for modern linguists to piece together their story. The mummies remain, silent yet eloquent, their very existence a challenge to the idea that ancient worlds were ever truly separate. They didn't disappear, they dissolved into the tapestry of humanity, their legacy written not in stone, but in strands of DNA and the stubborn persistence of memory. When Columbus made landfall in the Bahamas in 1492, he didn't find an untouched paradise, he stumbled into a thriving world. The Taino people, who had inhabited the Caribbean for centuries, greeted him with curiosity, offering gifts of woven cotton and golden ornaments. Their villages stretched from Cuba to Puerto Rico, their canoes threading between islands like stitches holding the archipelago together. Yet within 50 years, their population collapsed from an estimated 2 million to near oblivion. This wasn't just conquest, it was annihilation by 1,000 cuts, disease, enslavement, and the slow erasure of an entire way of life. The first and deadliest blow came unseen. European ships carried more than silk and steel. They bore pathogens to which the Taino had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and influenza ripped through island communities with terrifying speed. Spanish friar Bartolomé de las Casas documented villages where corpses rotted unburied. the living too weak to perform rituals. Modern epidemiologists estimate 90% of the population perished within 2 decades, a demographic catastrophe that left fields untended and traditions fractured. But disease alone doesn't explain the totality of the collapse. The survivors faced a more insidious fate, the encomienda system, a form of slavery disguised as protection. Taino men were forced into gold mines, their hands mangled by rock and mercury poisoning, while women labored on cassava plantations. Suicide became so rampant that Spanish colonists imported hunting dogs to track down families who fled into the mountains. Yet the Taino didn't vanish without resistance. In 1513, Chief Hatui led a rebellion in Cuba, warning his people that the Spanish worshipped a god of greed. Captured and sentenced to burn at the stake, he was offered a last-minute baptism. When asked if he wanted to go to heaven, Hatui famously replied, "Are there Spaniards there?" "Then I choose hell." His defiance echoes through time, a reminder that extinction wasn't passive acceptance but a brutal imposition. The most haunting legacy lies in what was almost lost and what endured. Taino words like hammock, hurricane, and tobacco seeped into global languages, their agricultural genius cultivating cassava, sweet potatoes, and pineapples transformed diets worldwide. Modern genetic studies reveal that up to 60% of Puerto Ricans carried Taino ancestry, their DNA whispering through generations despite colonial efforts to declare the culture extinct. In remote Dominican villages, elders still prepare casé bread using millennia-old techniques, while Cuban families preserve oral histories of Atabi, the mother goddess. The Taino story isn't one of disappearance, but of resilience disguised as erasure. Their canoes still glide across the Caribbean, not as relics, but as symbols of a people who navigated catastrophe as surely as they once navigated the sea's shifting currents. When modern descendants revive their language or replant traditional crops, they're not resurrecting the dead. They're acknowledging what colonialism tried to silence, that the Taino never left. They simply went underground like roots waiting for the right season to rise again. Beneath Sichuan's fertile plains, farmers digging a well in 1986 uncovered a site that would rewrite Chinese history, a pit filled with bronze faces unlike anything the world had ever seen. Wide, angular eyes, ears stretched to impossible dimensions, gold foil clinging to features so alien they seemed ripped from a fever dream. These were the relics of Sangsingdui, a civilization that thrived in China's Sichuan basin around 1200 BCE, crafting artwork so bizarre and technically advanced that their abrupt disappearance feels like history's greatest cliffhanger. How does a culture capable of casting bronze statues weighing over 800 pounds vanish without leaving a single written word or obvious heir? The scale of Sangsingdui's artistry defies explanation. At the excavation site, archaeologists unearthed over 1,000 artifacts in just 2 sacrificial pits, life-sized human figures with elongated hands and hollow eyes, bronze trees adorned with birds and dragons, even a 6-foot-tall statue of a man with exaggerated facial features that wouldn't look out of place in a modern surrealist gallery. The most haunting finds are the masks, some with protruding pupils like telescopes, others with grimacing mouths stretched wide enough to swallow the sky. Unlike the more restrained bronzes of the Shang dynasty to the north, Sangsingdui's creations pulse with raw, almost otherworldly energy. What's truly baffling is how little we know about the people behind these masterpieces. Unlike contemporary civilizations, Sangsingdui left no written records, no king lists, no battle accounts, not even mundane trade receipts. Their language, if they had one, is lost. What remains are silent testimonies in bronze, a kneeling figure gripping a ceremonial vessel, an altar where sacrifices may have been made, and fragments of gold masks so thin they flutter like leaves at the slightest touch. The absence isn't just puzzling, it's deliberate. Every artifact was ritually broken or burned before burial, as if the culture itself was performing its own funeral. Theories about their fate veer from the plausible to the apocalyptic. Geological surveys reveal evidence of an earthquake around 1200 BCE, a tremor violent enough to divert the nearby Min River, potentially flooding Sangsingdui's heartland. But natural disaster doesn't fully explain the ritualized destruction. Some scholars point to internal revolt. The masks and figures may represent gods or rulers whose failures led to their violent dethroning. Others speculate about invasion, though no weapons or battle debris have been found. The most haunting possibility, they simply walked away, yet the most tantalizing clue lies in their DNA. Recent genetic studies link Sangsingdui's population to the ancient Qiang people of the Tibetan Plateau, suggesting a possible migration to escape environmental or political collapse. Even more intriguing are faint stylistic echoes in later Chu and Dian cultures, hints that Sangsingdui's artistic genius didn't die, but seeped into the cultural groundwater of southern China. Their bronze masks now stare from museum cases, silent witnesses to a civilization that chose to take its secrets to the grave. High in the desert cliffs of Utah, where the wind hums through narrow canyons, the Fremont people left behind a gallery of rock art that defies simple explanation. Spirals dance alongside broad-shouldered human figures with hollow eyes, while bighorn sheep leap across the sandstone in ochre and white. These weren't nomadic hunters, they were farmers who coaxed maize and beans from arid soil, builders who crafted pit houses and granaries to withstand the seasons. Yet by 1300 CE, their fields lay fallow, their painted figures the only voices left in the silence. What could drive a culture so deeply rooted from the land they'd shaped for centuries? The Fremont story begins with adaptation. Unlike their ancestral Puebloan neighbors to the south, they straddled two worlds, planting crops in spring, then roaming the mountains to hunt elk and gather pine nuts when the heat came. Their pottery carried the fingerprints of both traditions, plain gray utility ware for storage, but also strikingly vivid figurines adorned with shell beads and feathers. At Range Creek Canyon, archaeologists uncovered granaries perched like eagles' nests high on cliff faces, stuffed with enough maize to feed whole villages through lean winters. This wasn't just survival, it was a delicate balancing act between earth and sky. Then the rains faltered. Tree rings from the Great Basin tell a grim tale, a megadrought stretching from 1250 to 1300, one so severe it dwarfed the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. For the Fremont, who relied on snowmelt to irrigate their fields, this wasn't just hardship, it was existential. Pollen samples from their final settlements show a desperate shift to prickly pear and grass seeds, plants that thrive in desperation. At Baker Village, a site abandoned mid-meal, grinding stones still hold the ghostly residue of last meals, corn kernels ground to dust alongside bitter goosefoot seeds. Yet drought alone doesn't explain the completeness of their departure. Unlike the Mesa Verde cliff dwellers who left behind pottery and tools, many Fremont sites show signs of deliberate closure. Doorways to pit houses were sealed with stone slabs as if the occupants intended to return. Some granaries were emptied with care while others remained stocked, perhaps offerings to spirits or promises to themselves. The most haunting clues lie in the rock art itself. At 9 Mile Canyon, later petroglyphs overlay earlier ones, not with violence but with quiet repetition, as if each generation was trying to etch their presence deeper into the stone. Archaeologists debate whether the Fremont vanished or simply transformed. Some skeletal remains show signs of malnutrition, supporting theories of dispersal or assimilation into neighboring groups. Others point to oral traditions from the Ute and Paiute peoples which speak of ancient ones who taught them to harvest desert plants, a possible echo of Fremont knowledge surviving beyond their culture's collapse. The truth may lie in between. In the Great Basin's harsh embrace, identities were fluid, and survival sometimes meant shedding the old to embrace the new. The Fremont's legacy lingers not in grand ruins, but in subtler traces, a grindstone found beside a modern highway, a petroglyph catching the sunsets glow the same way it did 8 centuries ago. Their disappearance wasn't an ending, but a merging, their ingenuity flowing like desert streams into the traditions of those who came after. In a land where water is memory, the Fremont remind us that even the deepest roots can learn to bend. Across the sun-baked landscapes of southwestern New Mexico, the Mimbres people left behind shattered beauty bowls painted with delicate black-on-white designs, each fragment telling a story in clay. These weren't just utilitarian objects, they were masterpieces, their surfaces alive with gamboling deer, geometric patterns echoing celestial movements, and mythic figures hovering between human and animal. Then, around 1150 CE, the kilns fell silent. Villages that had hummed with activity for generations emptied, their adobe walls crumbling back into the earth. What could silence a culture so deeply attuned to art and survival? The answer lies not in a single catastrophe, but in the slow unraveling of a delicate balance between creativity and climate. The Mimbres didn't just make pottery, they wove their worldview into it. At the Swartz ruin, archaeologists uncovered bowls buried with the dead, their bases ritually punctured, killed to release the spirit of the vessel into the afterlife. Scenes of daily life adorned their surfaces, a fisherman hauling a net, a rabbit darting through cactus, even a whimsical illustration of 2 men sharing a laugh over a cooking fire. This artistry wasn't decoration, it was a language, a way to document their relationship with the land, but around 1100 something shifted. Designs grew simpler, then repetitive. The vibrant storytelling faded, as if the artists were losing not just inspiration, but the very stories that anchored them. Drought tightened its grip. Tree rings from the Gila wilderness reveal a punishing dry spell that began in the late 11th century, stretching decades with only fleeting relief. For the Mimbres, who relied on seasonal rains to nourish their maize, beans, and squash, this wasn't just hardship, it was an existential threat. At the Mattox ruin, researchers found corn cobs smaller than a child's thumb, their kernels stunted from thirst. But the Mimbres weren't passive victims. They adapted, digging deeper irrigation channels and shifting crops to hardier varieties. The real crisis came when even these measures failed. By the mid-12th century, layers of wind-blown silt began filling their once fertile fields, a silent testament to erosion from overworked land. Yet climate alone doesn't explain the eerie completeness of their departure. Unlike other ancestral Puebloan groups who left behind tools or relocated en masse, the Mimbres seem to have dissolved into the landscape. At the Galaz ruin, excavations revealed something startling. Homes abandoned mid-meal, grinding stones still dusted with cornmeal, as if the inhabitants had stepped out briefly and never returned. No signs of violence, no hastily built defenses, just emptiness. Some archaeologists argue this points to a spiritual breaking point. The Mimbres' cosmology revolved around harmony. When the rains failed and their art lost its voice, perhaps they saw their world as irreparably out of balance. The most haunting clues, though, lie in their final pottery. In the last decades before abandonment, a new style emerged, bold, almost frenetic designs with figures crammed into every available space. One bowl from the Joyce Well site shows a procession of antlered figures marching toward a jagged line, a river, a rift. The meaning is lost, but the urgency is palpable. It's as if the artists were trying to compress every remaining story into their final works, racing against time itself. What became of the Mimbres remains one of the Southwest's quietest mysteries. Some scholars trace their legacy in the pottery traditions of the Zuni and Hopi, where echoes of those black-on-white motifs occasionally surface. Others believe they scattered into smaller, mobile groups, trading pottery for survival. Their disappearance wasn't sudden, like a snuffed flame, but more like ink dissolving in water, leaving behind only faint traces of what once was. The bowls endure, their artistry undimmed by centuries, each one a silent plea to remember not just how they vanished, but how vividly they once thrived. In the Tarim Basin's shifting sands, where China's western deserts whisper secrets to the wind, the Tocharians carved out a civilization that defied geography and time. These Indo-European speakers, tall, fair-haired, and clad in vibrantly dyed woolens, thrived in oasis cities like Kucha and Turfan, their very existence a paradox, European roots grafted onto the heart of Central Asia. By 800 CE, their distinct culture had dissolved into the tapestry of Igha rule, leaving behind manuscripts in a forgotten tongue and mummies so lifelike they seem poised to speak. How does a people who left behind such vivid traces vanish from history's stage? The answer lies in the slow alchemy of trade, faith, and the relentless tides of conquest. The Tocharian story begins with their language, a relic that stunned linguists when deciphered in the early 20th century. Buddhist texts preserved in monastic caves near Dunhuang revealed a tongue closer to ancient Celtic and Latin than to Mandarin or Igha. These documents, written in a modified Indian script, spanned prayers, medical treatises, and even love poems. Like a sunflower turns to the sun, so my thoughts turn to you. Yet this literary richness masked a quiet decline. As Silk Road caravans increasingly bypassed their cities in favor of northern routes, Tocharian merchants found themselves sidelined in their own land. The very trade that had enriched them now funneled newcomers, Igha horsemen and Sogdian middlemen, into their streets. Archaeology paints a vivid picture of this cultural blending. At the Kizil Caves, murals from the 6th century show Tocharian nobles with ginger beards and emerald-green tunics alongside Igha warriors in plated armor. By the 8th century, the pigments darken, the faces grow rounder, the robes more layered. No invasion tore down Tocharian temples, no sack or slaughter. Instead, their Buddhist monasteries gradually adopted Igha patrons, their scribes adding Turkic glosses to Tocharian palm leaf manuscripts. A marriage contract from 792, written in both languages, captures this transition. A Tocharian bride taking a Igha groom, her dowry listed in bilingual meticulousness: silver cups, a lapis lazuli necklace, and a prized Bactrian camel. Yet the most haunting evidence of their disappearance lies in the bodies they left behind. The Tarim mummies preserved by the desert's dry embrace wear textiles woven with motifs identical to those found in Hallstatt, Austria. One child, buried with a felt hat and tiny woolen boots, clutches a poppy pod, hinting at rituals carried from the steppes. Modern DNA tests confirm their origins. A people who trekked eastward 4,000 years ago, carrying with them the seeds of Indo-European culture. By the time the Ighas established their cognate in the 8th century, that genetic signature had diluted, blended into the broader Central Asian gene pool like salt dissolving in water. The Tocharians didn't so much fall as fade, their legacy surviving in subtle ways. The Igha word for honey is bal, borrowed directly from Tocharian bees' milk. Their Buddhist art influenced the Dunhuang frescoes that later dazzled the Tang dynasty. Even their agricultural innovations, vineyards irrigated by Korez underground channels, still quench Xinjiang's thirst today. Their disappearance wasn't an erasure, but a merging, proving that cultures, like rivers, may change their names as they flow through time, but never truly vanish. The mummies' lips may be stitched shut by centuries, but their presence lingers in the land's dust, waiting for the next desert wind to stir their story anew. The cliffs of Tenerife still whisper the name of a people who once defied the sea, the Guanche, towering in stature and fiercely proud, who had lived untouched in the Canary Islands since time immemorial. By the late 15th century, their resistance collapsed under the swords and diseases of European invaders, their language silenced, their mummified ancestors burned as curiosities. But this wasn't just conquest, it was the erasure of an entire world, one that had thrived in isolation for millennia, developing customs as strange and wondrous as the volcanic islands they called home. Imagine standing on the black sands of La Gomera in 1400, watching Guanche shepherds navigate sheer cliffs with nothing but balance poles and bare feet. their whistled language carrying across ravines like birdsong. These weren't primitive islanders, they were master adapters crafting tools from obsidian, preserving their dead with techniques eerily similar to the Egyptians, and worshipping a mountain they believed held up the sky. Their society revolved around the Mensi, kings who ruled through divine mandate, and the Zaxos, mummified ancestors whose leathery skins were stuffed with herbs and sand to keep their spirits anchored to the land. Then came the Europeans, armed not just with crossbows, but with an unshakable belief in their right to possess every island they touched. The first contact was a massacre in miniature. In 1402, French slavers landed on Lanzarote, capturing dozens of guanche to sell in Lisbon's markets. What followed wasn't outright war, but a slow strangulation. Spanish chroniclers wrote of the guanche's physical prowess: men who could leap ravines in a single bound, women who carried water in sealed goatskins up vertiginous trails, yet even their strength couldn't withstand smallpox and influenza. By 1494, the final Mensi of Tenerife, Bentor, hurled himself from a cliff rather than surrender, his body lost to the same Atlantic waves that had once carried his people to these islands. But the guanche didn't vanish without leaving traces. In La Palma's Cueva Belmaco, their spiral petroglyphs still coil across cave walls, their meaning as elusive as the people who carved them. Modern DNA tests reveal that nearly half of Canarian locals carry guanche ancestry, their genes surviving in the curl of a child's hair or the set of a fisherman's jaw. Even their whistled language, Silbo Gomaro, persists taught in schools as a living relic of a culture Europe tried to bury. The guanche's true end wasn't death but transformation, their blood mingling with their conquerors, their stories folded into the victors' histories like seeds carried on the wind. Their cliffs still stand, their caves still echo not as tombs, but as proof that even the most thorough erasure leaves cracks where memory seeps through. From the doomed settlers of Greenland clinging to European customs as the ice closed in, to the Mayan priests watching their celestial calculations fail under unrelenting drought, these 30 vanished civilizations share haunting parallels. Over and over, we see the same forces at work, not as isolated tragedies, but as a chorus of warnings echoing across millennia. Climate shifts that turned thriving farmlands to dust. Trade routes snapping like overstretched threads. Societies so rigid in their traditions that adaptation came too late. And always the heartbreaking moment when the last artisan puts down their tools, the last scribe stops writing, the last farmer abandons their field. Yet these aren't just stories of collapse, they're testimonies to ingenuity. The Indus Valley's sewer systems, the Tiwanaku's frost-defying fields, the Nabateans' desert water traps, all prove how brilliantly our ancestors fought against the odds. Their downfalls weren't inevitable. The Moch might have survived if their rulers had questioned the gods instead of sacrificing more victims. The Greenland Norse could have learned seal hunting from the Inuit. The choices that sealed their fates feel uncomfortably familiar. Short-term gain over sustainability, dogma over adaptability, walls built higher instead of bridges extended. What lingers most are the gaps the languages will never decipher, the rituals we can only guess at. The Cucuteni Tripilia's spirals, the Sangsingdui's hollow-eyed masks, the Rapa Nui's birdman cult, these weren't primitive doodles or savage rites. They were the beating heart of complex worldviews, entire philosophies reduced to fragments. Every time a looted tomb vanishes into a private collection or a rising sea swallows a coastal ruin, we lose another piece of humanity's puzzle. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies not in how these cultures fell, but in how they endured. The Lapita became the Polynesians. The Hittites lived on in Neo-Hittite cities. The Taino's DNA still sings in Caribbean veins. Their stories remind us that disappearance isn't always extinction, sometimes it's metamorphosis. As we face our own era of climate crises and social fractures, these ancient voices urge us to choose transformation over stubbornness, to listen as much as we build. The next civilization to sift through our ruins won't judge us by our monuments, but by the wisdom we etched into them and the flexibility we showed when the world changed. Let's leave them more than warnings. Let's leave them